This episode is supported by Momento, a serverless cache that you can trust and only charges you for what you use. To learn more, visit gomomento.co/theburningmonk. Hi, welcome back to another episode of Real-World Serverless. And today we're joined by Matthieu Napoli. Hey man, how you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm doing really great. I hope you are as well.
Yeah, and we finally caught up in person at the recent AWS Hero Summit in Seattle, and I've been really interested about Bref for a little while. I've heard a few people talk about it publicly, and I spoke with, I think, one company who was using Bref, and they were really happy with it. And so, I wanted to talk to you about Bref, and maybe we can start by this PHP framework for building the Lambda functions. And you mentioned when we have a conversation earlier that PHP has some interesting life cycles, which makes it quite different from other languages. Before we get into that, do you want to take a moment and just introduce ourselves? Where your background is, how you get into serverless. I know you used to work for the server framework for a little bit as well. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. So to start off, I live in France, and at the moment I'm a consultant. I create my own company, mostly based around working with Bref and creating serverless applications with PHP. So the main thing is some background. I'm a developer. And the main thing that got me started with serverless is that I never enjoyed doing like the sysadmin stuff. I have worked with servers, I have worked with containers. I just don't wish that on anyone else. I wish it was simple as, I write my application and I deploy that into the cloud and it just works. And obviously we both know that it's not just as simple as that, even though it should be. But that's how I got started into the serverless AWS Lambda movement, if I can say. And I've always worked with PHP. So when I learned about Lambda, I wanted to run PHP on Lambda. That was in 2017 at the time. And PHP was not supported natively by Lambda. It still isn't supported natively by Lambda. So I started a project called Bref, which is an open source PHP runtime that basically lets you run PHP on Lambda and run PHP frameworks on Lambda. And so I started that as an open source project. At the time I was employed, I had a job, then I quit the job and I wanted to start working ideally full-time on the project, but obviously you have to earn money somewhere. So I started doing some freelance jobs, consulting. And so I've been doing a combination of that since 2017. I did work for a while on the serverless framework itself at Serverless, the company. It's been 2 years, I think, 2-3 years. Which was really, really interesting to work on such a large open source project.
Right, and I guess with PHP, with PHP you've got this, almost similar kind of execution model to Lambda. That one request is processed on its own. There's no sort of concurrency in that sense in that single process. I guess for folks who are not familiar with PHP, can you just explain how this life cycle with PHP kind of differs from other languages like, say, Node or Java, which take a different approach to concurrency?
Yeah, I think it was kind of a meme at the time so people in the PHP community were discovering Lambda and they were saying, oh, this is just like PHP, but for all languages. And people in other communities would discover Lambda and say, oh, this is just the PHP model applied to other languages. But this is a bit more complex than that, obviously. So the majority of PHP applications running out there run with an execution model, like an engine called PHP FPM, Fast CGI Process Manager. Yeah. And the idea is very simple, is that in PHP, your code runs and handles one request at a time. And so if you have 10 requests in parallel, you have 10 sub-processes, like PHP sub-processes. And so one handles one request at a time. So when you write your code, you never think about, oh, is this variable or this memory space being accessed or used by different requests? Or if I set a global, I don't know, like the user session in a global variable, maybe I will leak the session between different requests. That doesn't happen with PHP. And so that makes the experience quite simple to get started with and program applications. And so with Lambda, you have kind of the same idea where one Lambda instance handles only one request at a time or one invocation at a time. So that's why I joke and say that PHP is one of the best language for serverless because of this execution model. But it's kind of a paradox that it's not the one that's like the one of the major language that is not supported by Lambda.
Yeah, at least not natively. And I guess that's where Bref comes in, right? So with Bref, do you? I guess I get that you've got a way to structure your application that is going to deploy to Lambda. But do you also come with a custom runtime for running PHP applications as well?
Yeah, exactly. So just for fun, the history of Bref started with, at the time on Lambda, there was no such thing called as the custom runtimes. There were a few runtimes that were supported, like Node and Python and some others, and you couldn't do anything else. And so the first Bref versions actually were Node function with a Node script that would execute PHP as a sub-process and pass the request, as a CLI argument and get the response as a CLI argument back, which is, in a sense, what was done many, many years ago with Apache, with CGI, I think it was called, which is not really efficient, I agree, but, it works. And I know some companies actually put that into production, even though it was really experimental at the time. But that's how it used to run. Now it's very different. Obviously, Lambda introduced the concept of custom runtimes, so you can add support for any language on Lambda, and that's what Bref does. So instead of you compiling PHP, like the binary for it to run on Amazon Linux, and for you to write all the glue, then Bref provides that for you, and so you have what is called a custom runtime, which is also called a layer. It's a zip file containing the PHP binary, containing the glue that starts the PHP binary, starts PHP FPM, connects with Lambda and the custom runtime API, and does all of the connection needed. And so if you are a PHP company or developer, you don't have to think about how do I run PHP on Lambda. You can just use that custom runtime. It feels like it's natively supported runtime.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And as I've been on the website, I've seen that I guess the syntax you use to configure your functions and your application is actually very similar to the server framework. I guess is that where you've taken some of the inspiration from how to structure, I guess, your application and to specify your functions. I guess while we're here, do you have anything that you can maybe show us so that we can, so for folks who are not familiar with Bref, they can see what it's like to kind of work with Bref and how to deploy your functions and so on?
Yeah, sure. I will share my screen. And actually, the Bref at the moment uses serverless framework. This is like the serverless framework.
Okay.
The way it works, so this is the same YAML syntax that you have in serverless framework. It means you have to install serverless framework on your machine, so the serverless CLI. And this is an example of serverless.yaml, same file. You have to install the serverless framework CLI. And the main difference is, so how do you support PHP when it's not supported natively? So serverless framework can deploy functions in Node.js, in Python, and in any language. It's just that, the runtime, you don't have PHP natively. So this runtime here, PHP 8.3 FPM, this is something provided by the Bref plugin for serverless framework. And so you have to include that line here. And this Bref plugin will actually extend serverless framework and add support for deploying PHP runtime.
So that is pointing to I guess a local plugin. Do you also publish the plugin to npm as well?
Yeah, so that's exactly what people think when they think about serverless framework plugins. You have to publish them to npm and install them with npm. That makes sense. It's a Node ecosystem. What I wanted to do is provide for PHP developers like an experience where you don't even have to think about npm. So vendor is actually the same thing as Node modules, but for PHP. And so you install Bref with Composer, which is like npm for PHP. So instead of package.json, it's composer.json. I install Bref. I have, with this installation, I have the code for the runtime. I have PHP code, but I also have, if we open that up, so I have like PHP code in there, but we also have an index.js file, and that's the serverless framework plugin. And so I can use a relative path because I know it will always be this path, thanks to how Composer works. And I can skip, Node module and npm.
Right. So
And
this is just so that folks who are working with PHP don't really have to think about Node. They just have to, I guess they still have to have Node so they can install the serverless framework. But after that,
yes.
when it comes to managing like plugins and things like that, you kind of shield them away from the, I guess, the server framework ecosystem. Just want to have them work with Bref.
Yep. And so most people don't understand how this works or what this does. And I think they, like what I say, usually you don't have really to understand. It just works. It's just like if you had a Bref package on npm, you would just use Bref, but just Bref is not distributed on npm because it's a PHP package.
Right, gotcha.
And so you can see here I have a warning because I have the serverless.yml validation that the IDE has, and it doesn't recognize PHP because that's not supported. But thanks to the plugin, it's actually working. It's actually supported. So I have a warning,
Okay.
but I can safely ignore it. And the rest is honestly very, very like the usual. If you've written serverless applications using Node.js, I can use URL true, but yeah, same is very, very familiar.
And I guess this is based on the server framework version 3, because I know version 4, they're making a whole bunch of different changes.
Yes, this is actually a topic in the Bref community. Like, what do we do with these versions? So Bref currently works with V3 and V4, and I want to support both, and I want to continue to support both for the reason that from the perspective of the users of Bref, they don't interact directly with serverless framework. And so some of them will be okay with migrating to version 4 and using the product that is no longer open source or fully open source, and maybe paying a license, which is very fine. I support companies that want to support open source projects. This is great. Some will want to stay on V3, and I respect that because it wasn't really part of the deal when you got started with Bref. So what I want to do is provide long-term support for serverless framework V3 and basically have people keep using Bref and serverless.yml for as long as they want. And on top of that, I'm also working on. So the thing is, right now, what you're seeing is the current Bref experience. You're writing serverless.yml, and it works really great. And for those who have used serverless framework, it's really great at deploying applications. Like here, I can deploy, here a single file, but I can deploy a Laravel application, a Symfony application, a huge application if I want to. It really starts to become complex when you have maybe queues, but mostly databases. Like most PHP applications have a relational database. Maybe they want a cache with Redis, maybe a VPC. And so what I want to do is provide an alternative to serverless.yml that makes it much simpler to deploy PHP applications, because most PHP applications, are very standard. Like we talk about the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. So I see most Bref users want a database. That's like 90% of them. So I want to provide, that's something I'm working on at the moment, but I want to provide an experience that is even simpler than that. But anyway, that's in the works, so I don't want to talk too much about what's coming, but what do we have now? This is it.
Okay.
And so to deploy,
deployment. Do you use like a Bref command or do you use a serverless deploy?
Serverless deploy, and it will do its thing. I already deployed just before starting the podcast, just so that it's a bit faster. But yeah, you get the usual experience, and you get the URL here. And if I open that up, and I'm crossing my fingers so that it all goes well. This is the PHP script I have here by default. And if we look into that, it's a very simple PHP file. So it's actually, if you've seen PHP in the last 20 years, it looks like that. You mix up PHP language and HTML. This is just for the demo. Most of the time, it's a real framework with proper code, and you have templates and everything. It's much cleaner than that, but that's just for the demo.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. So in that case, for folks who are, I guess, who are used to who are coming from PHP background, what do they have to do to kind of rewrite the application? Because that's one of the challenges often we find with other languages as well. You come from Node.js, you're used to writing Express applications. Suddenly, Lambda forces you, or if you want to follow the single responsibility functions, you end up having to write your application in a different way. I guess with PHP, you probably also have a similar thing where you are used to writing web application using like a framework. Now with Bref, you have to kind of structure your application in a certain way so that you've got the indexed PHP file and maybe other .php files for different endpoints. You know how traffic spikes can cause outages, right? Our sponsor this week, Momento, can help. Do you need easy to provision infrastructure that is robust and responsive even when you're under a huge amount of load? And do you want a caching that can work at scale without the hustle of managing and scaling the cache cluster? There's no need to be concerned about a single or a cluster of nodes getting overwhelmed by a sudden spike in traffic. Momento gives you the fastest time to market and the most reliable performance at scale. So, are you ready for your next traffic spike? Check out gomomento.co/theburningmonk for more information today. Okay, back to the episode. Do you also support, the Lambdaliths model where you can take your existing, I don't know, what's a popular PHP web framework and can just run your function run your code inside Lambda function?
Yes, and so this is where I don't know if PHP and the ecosystem is different from the other languages, but I've seen honestly lots of success with running monolith on Lambda. And I know that for a long time I was really following what best practices I heard about from different people in the community, but I just came back to watching people use Bref at scale, building real applications, and there was so much success with like taking either a legacy application. I have a case study about that, which is really interesting. We can get into that later, but taking a legacy monolith, or even like a new application written with Laravel or Symfony, like those popular frameworks, and you put that inside one Lambda function. And so the handler file that you see index.php, it's actually the same here. With Symfony and Laravel, there's usually like one entry point, which is index.php. And then you have the framework do the routing. So you don't use API gateway for the routing. You have like one Lambda function and it runs the whole application, API, website, whatever. And that works really well. I've seen some people try to split up, and I'm talking about HTTP routes, but it's usually a lot of work. And when you do that, you step outside of the frameworks. And so I guess in languages where maybe, I know I've worked with Express.js, for example, and the layer or the features provided by Express.js are useful, but they are not the same kind of features you have with Laravel, for example. So if you replace Express.js with API gateway and its routing and its kind of middlewares, with the authorizers, you get similar value and you don't lose a lot by doing that. But if you replace Laravel with API gateway, you lose a lot. So I think with PHP, there's more incentive to staying with one Lambda function, use a framework, and it works really well. There is obviously one exception to that is when you want to handle, you have SQS queues, or you want to buffer jobs like queues with SQS. You can have multiple queues. You can be using SNet or Event Bridge for communication between microservices. That works really well in PHP, and it's used. And in these cases, you have functions, and usually the pattern I see is one function for the API or the website, and then one function for handling queues, one for Event Bridge events, and so on.
Okay, let's maybe dive deeper on that, because I really like the fact that you mentioned that. Okay, if you are using like Express.js and you're building application with the right level of modularity, so you're not just putting all of your business logic into like request handler directly in the rest in your say Express.js or Fastify or whatever framework, so that you can. I mean, I've worked for companies in the past where they couldn't move out of a dead open source web framework because there's no separation in the code, there's no modularity. All of your business logic is right there in the request handling bit, instead of having your own abstractions that handles create user command or whatever. You got your own abstraction for those different endpoints that ultimately encodes you into your business logic. If you're doing that, then your your code is very much similar to what you have in Lambda with individual functions for individual endpoints, and API gateway kind of replaces a lot of the configuration you have in your Express and the cross-cutting concerns like authentication. The middleware gets replaced by things the API gateway does it for you. But I didn't quite understand what you meant by. I understand what you said. Okay, that you don't lose too much when you do that with say Node, but it's not the same as Laravel or Symfony. That bit I didn't quite understand. What other things do you get with those frameworks that that you lose when you do the single responsibility functions with Lambda?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I want to be exhaustive, but I want to be obviously I this is like top of my head. But if I just think about authentication, I've been a long time like Symfony user. I've used Laravel more and more lately, and I'm just blown away by the amount of features you have out of the box with Laravel. And so just if we think about authentication, and if we use Laravel for authentication and dealing with users, like out of the box, you get obviously get the login, logout forms, and the authentication with the passwords. But you get the password rotation as well. Passwords are safely encrypted and hashed without rotating secrets. You have multi-factor authentication out of the box. You have team management. You have forgotten passwords with all the emails that are being sent for you. You have I don't know. You can have some rate limits on the authentication pages. I don't know, there's just so many things you get just like for this single bit, which is authentication. And you have obviously the permission system where you can set permissions on different routes and have middlewares to authenticate, like say these routes are private, these are for public pages, and you have roles. So you can say for certain users, you can access this path and not this path. So when you look at just this part, you have so much with Laravel. And if you drop like the authentication away from the whole request flow of your PHP app, then you lose all of that. And if you look at all the other middlewares or HTTP logic that you can get with Laravel, that's something I don't want to just drop that. And so it's kind of and I'm not saying this is a decision that is very simple for everyone and it's always the same, but I see lots of smaller or medium companies where using the framework and maybe being not decoupled from the framework makes sense, because you gain so much by using the frameworks to its full potential that it's worth it. In some other cases, obviously, you may want to decouple from the framework, and to me, it's the same logic as decoupling from AWS. Some companies might be like, oh, do we need to have an abstraction layer between our code and the AWS SDK and the event bridge, event message format, or even the SQS behaviors and anything that AWS provides? Do we need to abstract away from that? I'd say it depends, because if you just start using the AWS service, then you can get started and it works. Depending on the company and your goals, you may want to decouple, or you may want to use the thing immediately and get its full benefits.
Right. Okay. So I guess this kind of reminds me a little bit of the kind of things you get with, say, using Amplify, because Amplify gives you like additional directives and things like that on your GraphQL schema, so that you can model some of the fine-grained access control bits, which you may have to kind of implement between Cognito and your own the resolver code. So by modeling your domain, Amplify kind of gives you more tools that can do more for you. I guess it sounds like it's similar thing here as far as authentication is concerned, that just the middleware itself provides more out of the box, including the login, logout screens, which are something that you have to kind of build yourself if you want something that's more, brand compliant. You got your own logos and colors and things like that, which is not as easy to do with the Cognitos that hosted the domains. Okay. So we mentioned the Laravel a few times. You folks are using Laravel. There's also Laravel Vapor as well. So what's the kind of decision there? How do they choose between, say, using Bref versus Vapor?
Yeah, that's a good question. Bref is a combination of things. Vapor is a combination of things. So to clarify, you have the PHP runtime itself. In both cases, it's almost the same thing. It works between Vapor and Bref very similarly, and I don't think there are differences that people may notice. The main difference will be with the experience of deploying, I would say. Vapor is not based on CloudFormation, and it's not based on serverless.yaml or something like that. Most of the deployment happens, you have a bit of a YAML config file, but most of the deployment happens with they have a SaaS. It's basically a SaaS deploying into your AWS account. And so you have a UI and you go through Vapor to deploy into your AWS account. And yeah, that's about it. With Bref, you have the serverless.yaml file and you deploy with CloudFormation serverless framework into your account. Something I didn't mention as well is that Bref actually works with CDK. We do publish some CDK constructs. It works with SAM or even Terraform, because it's, again, you have the runtime and then you have whatever tooling you want to have on the deployment. So if you are not interested in serverless framework, you can use those things. So yeah, the main difference would be that Bref deploys from your machine to AWS, Vapor deploys from the SaaS into AWS. And because they do that, they have the ability to, for example, provide some metrics, a dashboard where you can view some information about the applications that you deploy, which is something honestly I really like. Like the experience with Vapor is something I aspire to have at some point with Bref. So what I did a couple of years ago, I released the Bref dashboard, which is an alternative to the AWS console where you can view like your applications, logs, metrics, and etc. But again, since I don't have a SaaS, and you have to run the applications locally on your machine, and it uses your local credentials and connects to AWS and shows whatever you have access to. If that makes sense. So the model is a bit different here. And I
guess
actually
because
sorry,
go on.
No, go ahead.
And I guess because you're using serverless framework and therefore CloudFormation, you also get additional things that CloudFormation gives you, things like being able to set outputs and exports so that you can have multiple applications that potentially reference each other, because you're able to create those say CloudFormation output, or create things like SSM parameters so that you can share your API URL with other services that may want to call your API or reference other services. Pass information around, like share the VPN, VPC IDs, security groups, and things like that. Where I guess the Vapor is more built around Laravel itself, so less about the CloudFormation. So if you want to bring in other things into your application configuration, do they let you configure a DynamoDB table as part of the application or other things like that?
No, but you own the AWS account. So
okay.
Let's say and I've seen that several times where people start with Vapor and they have the Laravel application working, you have the database and it's working fine, but then you want to step out of just, the LAMP stack basically and have like use Event Bridge or SNS or even SES and DynamoDB and whatever. You have to do it manually. You have to figure out AWS on your own. Then you're completely outside of Vapor. And so I would love to have something as good as Vapor in terms of experience, but with the constraints, that's like my goal, that my North Star is like that experience with, finding a good solution so that you are not limited to having one SaaS, having admin access to your account, which is a blocker for some companies, and staying on CloudFormation and providing you the tools to more easily step out of the base. Like deploying the Laravel app is one thing, and then you want, as you said, like DynamoDB tables or whatever, you can do that without having to start from scratch with AWS. That's something I'm exploring with something I call Bref Cloud, which is a project I'm experimenting with at the moment, where you have a SaaS that can deploy in your account, but you can also self-host the thing, which is a way for me to solve the problem of third-party access to the account. And it's all based around CloudFormation, so you can have, just like in serverless.yaml or SAM or CDK, you can bring your own config or constructs and deploy DynamoDB tables or whatever you want. So you can start easily and then expand without having to restart from scratch. That's kind of my vision. I'm trying to keep these constraints in mind to find a good experience, because I'm not, so the audience for Bref is not, I think, the same as what you may be experiencing. Like some Bref users in companies, they want to use AWS. And they see Bref, they're like, oh, maybe we'll use Bref, but we want to use AWS. We'll train on AWS and we'll learn AWS and we'll use as much as possible of it. That's like a minority. Most of the Bref users, they want a scalable, redundant, easy to deploy application without, starting up a Kubernetes cluster and getting too crazy. So like AWS is a plus, but they don't really want to be and train to become an AWS master. So I want to provide the path to get into AWS as easily as possible.
Right. Okay. So I guess in that case, what you're saying is that, let's contain, as far as Bref versus Laravel Vapor is concerned, Laravel Vapor is about, deploying your PHP application onto Lambda so that you get all the scalability, redundancy, and the DevOps automation and things like that. But it doesn't quite help you once you want to get out of just your code. You want to start using other AWS services, whereas Bref, because it's CloudFormation based, so that you can create application, an AWS-based application, a cloud-native application that uses PHP. You can have all the different tools. But what you are then saying is that actually a lot of companies are not the kind of want to build a cloud-native application. More just I want to build a PHP application that runs in the cloud. So maybe they're not thinking straight away. They want to use EventBridge. They want to use SNS. They want to just start with a PHP application that comes that uses a database that connects to say RDS. Okay, right, gotcha.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Like a majority a majority will actually have one AWS like CloudFormation stack, one application, or just a few. But we are not talking about microservices working together. You have one big application, and you are looking for an alternative to. The path usually is you start with a VPS or a server or whatever. You have one thing, and it works, but then you cross a threshold where you need multiple servers for redundancy because the business now requires it, or you are hitting scaling limits. And so you need to go from 1 to n. And so you have the option of do I want to maintain multiple servers and do load balancing and do like recovery in case one crashes or whatever? Do I go with Kubernetes and have n being infinite, so then I have to manage the cluster? Or do I go with Lambda? And so Lambda is the alternative. But you still have some companies going all in on AWS and microservices. They don't follow exactly the same pattern, but I would say this is a minority in the lot. And usually I call like Lambda and Bref the gateway drug to AWS because they get started. Then they're like, oh, actually, we could use SES and we could use an event whenever there's a new file uploaded on S3 to do this thing. And maybe we could push that into that new service so that the marketing team or whatever can do complementary work. And so they get started slowly like that with AWS and then they expand. So I found that really interesting to see. It kind of enables new things once they are in AWS. So that's not the first goal usually.
Right, yeah, because that makes sense because on PHP server, if you're just building on if you're running on a VPS, then you can have cron jobs, and CPU will do that. All of the cron jobs, the background tasks, all run on the same thing as your API server, and obviously that's not going to really work on the Lambda's execution-based models. So you have to kind of start thinking, okay, if I need to have a cron job that runs every at the end of every day, I can't just shove it into my Laravel application like I used to. I have to have a separate thing that gets invoked by a schedule at this particular time every single day. And so that starts to makes you start looking into EventBridge, cron expressions and Lambda functions, and then start working from there to start maybe exposing to S3 for storage, maybe DynamoDB for databases. Okay, let's see. So I guess you talk about a few customers who are kind of different customers kind of having different adoption models. Do you have some examples like success stories they can share of customers who are using Bref today? On the website, it says that you guys have something like 36 billion messages handled with Bref in the last month. So that's obviously some pretty sizable customers are using it already.
Yeah, 36 billion Lambda. I don't put Lambda invocation because it's kind of unclear what it is to new new
Right.
users, so I put requests or jobs, but this is Lambda invocations across all of Bref users, and this is refreshed live. I mean, there's a cache obviously, but this is a metric coming from CloudWatch, and this is a metric I collect via an anonymous telemetry thing I implemented inside of Bref. But yeah, basically the Bref is used at scale and across lots of companies. And the question usually I get is, for what kind of project, what kind of applications is Bref or is Lambda and PHP or PHP? Where is it good for? And I think the answer is not really in the project. And just to illustrate that, these are the examples I usually give. So I have some very small projects like my blog or some small project I run on Lambda because it's really cheap. It's really simple, and I push it and it's deployed, and it's been like 5 years. I don't deploy it anymore. It just runs. It still runs. I used to use VPS, by the way, and then keeping up, like I had the VPS and I had an old PHP version. I deploy a new website. It doesn't work. I need to upgrade Apache. I need to upgrade the PHP versions. I need to make sure that MySQL is updated, and then security. It's much simpler with Lambda for the small websites. Then you have, I would say, the middle range where I have some companies that have 10 or 100 million requests a month, and even to bigger scale. Like one is Sua Musica. This is the biggest Bref website I know of. Sua Musica is a Brazilian website, like a Brazilian iTunes. It's a very popular website in Brazil, and they run with Bref, and they have more than 1 billion HTTP requests handled with PHP and Bref every month. So it's a huge scale. And so these are some examples, and even on the what do they do with it, it's very all over the place. You have some that just run the API or HTTP application with Bref. Some transitioned only for the jobs, the background jobs, because the application runs well on the server and it's fine. It's just that dealing with spiky workloads for the jobs, the background jobs, it's not working on the server. So they moved to only that part to SQS and Lambda, and it just flies because you can scale from 0 to infinity almost. So some customers do that, and again, some go all in with microservices. I have one story of Trésor, which is a French company. They're a bank, and they're like a bank as a service for neobanks. So if you're like I'm trying to think of their customers. I don't think Revolut is one, but Lydia was one, and like a few players that are well known in France when I actually used runs on Trésor. And so what they had at the time was a huge monolithic legacy PHP application, and was running on servers. And so what they did is they migrated that application into a single Lambda function. The whole thing, even though it's like not a good pattern, but that's what they did. Obviously, they did that with lots of testing, like load balancer to switch traffic progressively and everything. But yeah, eventually they had that old monolithic code base in one Lambda function for the HTTP API, and it worked. And it actually improved their response time. It improved the number of, reduced the number of incidents. So they had an improvement just moving the legacy app into a single Lambda function. And then they had a second migration where they split the legacy app into different microservices. Thanks to API gateway, based on the path, it goes to a different API gateway and then goes to a different Lambda function. So two-step migration, take the legacy app and put it on Lambda just to use the scaling and the simplicity of the hosting, and then split that up into microservices, and then they adopt. I'm not sure if they use SNS or even Bridge for communication, but yeah, then you can take advantage of everything AWS has to offer. For them, it was like a great success, that migration. But what I'm trying to say is that some just stop at the monolithic API, some go even further, and you have benefits at all of these points.
Yeah, I think that's a very popular pattern that I guess we're seeing more and more of. When people want to use a serverless or specifically Lambda because of all the, I guess, scaling, security, and redundancy benefit you get, but they don't want to rewrite the entire application. So a Lambda lift approach is really good for that. But I think a lot of the maybe people in the serverless ecosystem, myself included, still hope people would go thinking more about the fine-grained Lambda function so that you have more fine-grained access control and monitoring and things like that. That's maybe a question, I guess, for you then. For folks who are running monoliths using, say, Bref, what's the observability story like? Because that means you have one set of metrics for latency, for errors. How do you then debug, say, for example, one of the routes having errors, and that's triggering the alert, but everything's coming from one route? What are some of the things you do, or is anything in the PHP ecosystem you can leverage to make that debugging easier?
Yeah, that's the part that is not great. It's the one thing where PHP hasn't caught up with the rest of the serverless ecosystem, I would say, in the sense that you have plenty of tools that exist or SaaS like to monitor serverless applications, and some of them, most of them, I don't know an exact list, but they don't support PHP. So yeah, this is not the best story, I would say. What I've seen people do is just use the API gateway metrics and logs from CloudWatch and try to get on with it. I'm working on an X-ray integration because I think this is deeply lacking for PHP. We don't have X-ray support for PHP. So you can forget about that. That's something I want to fix. I have a beta package. I use it in my own project, and it's really awesome. I hadn't used X-ray before because of that, so I'm discovering that X-ray is pretty interesting. But yeah, I think you have New Relic, Datadog. It's a bit spread across. You have some profiling tools specifically for PHP. You have Tideways, you have Blackfire, and so they can provide like deep tracing for a single route or single invocation. Some are more about aggregating by route, but I want to be honest, it's not as good, I think, as what exists mostly in Node.js and what you can get in Node.js. So yeah, then I'm not sure if you split by route with API gateway, you could have observability, like you could see the average latency by HTTP route.
Yeah, you've enabled the detailed metrics that you can, but obviously that comes with additional cost, additional maybe the dashboards will have more things to look at to find out. Okay, if there's aggregate on aggregate, there's a higher latency. Which of the endpoint is having is responsible for that? But that's having sort of more detailed routes. At least you get more detailed metrics on the API gateway side of things at extra cost, of course.
Yeah. Most people I see, they don't go that route. They have a single latency. They have a single endpoint, so they have a single latency metric. And then I see a lot of usage of Sentry, which is mostly used for errors, but it also has the tracing abilities. So that's not perfect, but it's honestly not bad. Being able to have like the same behavior as X-ray, and that's one thing. You have alternatives that are very similar to Sentry, but mostly error focused, like Bugsnag or stuff like that.
Okay, gotcha. And I guess, and what about in terms of performance and cold start? Does the PHP custom runtime, and then there's also the PHP, I guess the Laravel application itself. Do they introduce a significant amount of cold start? I don't know what's the PHP kind of cold start characteristic is like compared to something like Node or Python.
I'm trying to make sure I have the right numbers, but if you take just the PHP layer, so you have an hello world, something I didn't mention, we have actually have 3 runtimes in Bref. One is just for running console commands, so let's ignore that because it's a really niche use case. So we have 2 runtimes. The one I showed in demo and the one we have been talking about since the beginning is the FPM runtime, and so it runs with PHP FPM. Like the thing that you run on any server, so it's very similar to the serverless web adapter pattern. That's the one that is mostly used, and this one has a cold start of about 300 milliseconds when used, as a custom runtime with a layer, and that's the base thing. And I think most of that time is starting the PHP process, but also downloading, the zip file internally. Lambda downloads or starts up the runtime, there's some latency involved. So it's not that bad, but it's not the best. Obviously, it's not the fastest. The second runtime is about just running the PHP code without FPM, and that one is mostly used for Event Bridge, SQS, anything that doesn't involve HTTP. And this one has a cold start of 250 milliseconds, so it's slightly faster because it doesn't contain the FPM binary. It's just a bit smaller. But however, that's like an empty application. If you take a default Laravel application, it's huge, especially because it contains the whole AWS SDK for all the APIs. It's I think it's more than 100 megabytes of code with a vendor, like the node modules of PHP. So it's huge, and you may have, and there's like initialization involved if you don't pre-compile or pre-cache some stuff. So it can go as high as 1 second. Usually, the default Bref experience is you just deploy and it works because we compile stuff on the fly. But if you go to production and you want to optimize your cold starts, you can pre-cache the routes and pre-cache the the views, and there are so many things you can pre-cache, and it gets a bit better. I would say the average with a real application would be about 500 milliseconds. So it's something you have to be ready to accept that. But yeah, most of the time you have to weigh the benefits and the downside of the cold start.
So I guess in terms of cold start, it's probably very similar to what you get with Node, depending on the size of the application. But it's just a question of whether or not how big the impact, say Laravel or Symfony has on your overall cold start time. But I guess a lot of that nowadays kind of depends on your traffic pattern more than anything else, because of the proactive initialization. You can save a lot of the cold start, or at least have them happen before the function serves a user request. So if your pattern is fairly stable, you're probably going to be okay. But if you are fairly spiky and predictable traffic pattern, then maybe you'll see more cold starts. So you probably need to spend more effort on making sure that when cold starts happen, you're still okay as far as your SLA is concerned. And that's maybe, I'm not sure exactly how you do the pre-caching, how does that work? I'm not familiar with PHP. So is that like a flag that you can turn on while you're compiling your PHP application?
It's actually not PHP specific, it's framework specific. Like Symfony and Laravel, they both have their cache. And what I mean by that is they pre-compile some of the, like even the views or the PHP config files into optimized PHP files. So it's all file-based. And so you can run a command before deploying, and it will just store the data in a more optimized fashion. Just for specific data structures like the config, the views, mostly config stuff that can be, pre-parsed and optimized. So it's all file-based, so it can be deployed in the archive that is being deployed.
And
Okay,
go on.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you actually a question. So this is something I have an assumption about, but one advantage I see as well with having the monolithic applications, you have one Lambda function for the whole API, and it's not magic, obviously, but you're supposed to have, that's what I picture, less cold start, because you always have some traffic on the public website or on the API, which means that you are less likely to have some cold starts on some routes that are less, they receive less traffic. So the way I see it is, the cold start will be worse with like a monolithic application, but at the same time, you will get less cold starts. I don't know if you have specific numbers of these
Yeah, I don't have a specific numbers that compares an application with the number of cold starts running as a single monolith or as individual functions. But in most cases, if you got some amount of traffic to sustain, and that's fairly stable across the entire API, if the same sort of traffic pattern is kind of mirrored on the different endpoints, then those endpoints will have the same sort of characteristic as far as, okay, you're not really going to see many cold starts because there's stable traffic. But if you have a case whereby for the whole API, there's a nice bell curve, but because you have so many different routes and the use pattern is so different that some endpoints will have nothing and then bang, and then bang, then the situation could be that you see a lot more cold starts on some endpoints, but then on others, you're okay. So it really depends on kind of the traffic pattern. I think for most applications, I mean, like that I use certainly, the usage pattern is the same for pretty much everyone. You use like Twitter, you come in, you read you read your feed, you interact. There's a few things that everyone kind of does regularly, so that the things that no one is really using. You might get worse cold starts, things like no one really goes to the page to read a legal document, for example, or maybe no one really goes to the page to set the profile page, to update the profile image or something like that. So there may be a few endpoints where literally not many people use, so you're gonna see more cold starts, but because they are small percentage of the overall request count. So it probably evens out if you're measuring, say, the P99 latency, comparing the two. But if you have an application that's just in general don't have a lot of traffic, so if you're like a reasonably popular application, so bell curve will be enough to make sure that every single endpoint, or at least the popular ones, would have a bell curve as well. But if you're starting a new application, there's only I don't know, hundreds of requests per hour, so your bell curve, it's gonna be enough to sustain like one or two instances of a Lambdalith, because there's always going to be a one request every couple of minutes. But then it's not going to be enough to sustain individual functions with individual endpoints, because it will mean that one endpoint will get one request every 20 minutes, and that will be a cold start every single time. So you probably need a baseline of amount of traffic to sustain the not having that many cold starts when you have a single response, one function per endpoint versus Lambdalith. So it is true when you have a really low throughput, say API, but once you get to a moderate amount of requests per day or per hour, the difference is probably just going to disappear.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, interesting.
So I think that's everything I had in mind. Do you have anything else that you want to share? Any kind of like a future projects or things that you want to kind of tell us about, get people to sign up, like books, courses on the Bref, maybe?
Well, this is the moment in the year. Usually I wait I said I have only had 2 major versions of Bref, but I'm working on version 3. So this is the moment where I brainstorm quite a lot, and I'm trying to think about what's missing from Bref. From the runtime itself, I'm looking at upgrading. On Lambda there's the Amazon Linux version, so I'm trying to upgrade the Amazon Linux version. So it means recompiling PHP and changing so much stuff that is under the hood, that is invisible, and it's really ungrateful work, but it has to be done. So that's something I'm working on. I'm also working on supporting the Lambda streaming response is something I really want to do, but it's implementing that both technically in the custom runtime and having that work with frameworks and providing a nice API for PHP users. Getting it right takes a bit of time, so that's not simple. So yeah, I'm working towards Bref v3, trying to find as well, as I mentioned, a solution for Bref to transition from being serverless framework oriented to something that is a bit more open. The main reason is serverless framework is changing. There's v4, which is a bit different in its open source model, in its commercial model. So finding a way to support and keep maintaining serverless framework v3, supporting v4 as well, expanding a little bit with CDK and SAM and Terraform, like providing options to Bref users, and working on this final option, which again I call Bref Cloud, which is a simpler configuration experience where you can very simply have the application, but also the database, the VPC, the caches, and have all of that with the UI to operate. That's something that's taking up a lot of my time at the moment, and I'm really excited by the progress. This is really fun to work on these things. So it's still in beta. If anyone listening to this is interested, I would love to get some feedback on the product. But yeah, hopefully I will have something to show very soon. That's all I'm doing at the moment.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, if anyone's listening and is using PHP and want to explore using PHP with Lambda, then yeah, try out Bref and let Matthieu know your feedback so that you can help shape the future version of Bref. So yeah, Matthieu, thank you so much for coming on here, and best of luck, and hope to see you at the reInvent this year.
Yeah, I hope so. I really hope so. I haven't booked any flight yet, but I really want to go. So
Okay, sounds good. Perfect. I'll see you there. Okay, take it, guys. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you to Momento for supporting this episode. To learn more about the real-time data platform and how they can help you accelerate product development, go to gomomento.co/theburningmonk for more information.